Games between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura, they're always fun to watch. But in the Champions Chess Tour final, with a shorter time control, you get to see the two best players in the world in this discipline. What's happening? After two draws, it's Armageddon time. And both players, they need to make a bid to determine who is getting the draw odds versus time advantage. Well, Hikaru said, okay, I want to play with 9 minutes and 40 seconds. And Magnus said, I want to play with 15 minutes. Well, what happens then? Magnus gets his 15 minutes and Hikaru is playing with 5 minutes less, but having the draw odds. Magnus, playing with white, needs to play for a win, whereas Nakamura is content if the game becomes a draw. Let's see what happens in this game. Subscribe to the channel to see more exciting games from this great tournament. Magnus, in a must-win situation, goes for e4, e5. Knight f3, knight f6. Magnus takes the pawn, and here the first surprise of the game. It's the pattern of defense, and most people, they play here this move d6, but Hikaru played the move knight takes e4. For a long time this was considered to be a big mistake, but this is modern theory. I will show you how this works. Magnus played here the relatively unknown move d3, and that's not going to offer him an advantage. But how about this move queen e2? It looks like you're winning the game on the spot. The knight is under attack. If you move the knight away, then it's knight c6 with a discovered check. You're winning the queen. So that is not good for black. Why did Hikaru go for this line? Well, nowadays it has been established that after the move queen e2, black can temporarily sacrifice a piece with the move queen e7, counter-attacking the knight on e5. White takes the knight on e4, but then black is gonna play this move d6. The knight cannot go away because then the queen on e4 hangs. The best white can do here is to play the move d4, supporting the knight, and after taking on e5 you do recapture with the pawn. White is a pawn up, but after a move like knight c6 there's actually quite a bit of theory, but black has good chances to hold here. That's not what you want to play as white in a must-win situation. Most of the games in this line have ended in a draw. So a very clever choice by Magnus. He wants to keep more play in the position. And objectively the move d3 is not the best move, but still all the pieces remain on the board. After d3, black goes knight f6, white goes d4, d5, bishop d3, bishop d6, castle kingside, symmetrical structure, but white is having a nice knight on e5, which needs to get more support. Bishop f4, rook e8, rook e1. And now also another interesting moment here. Black played the move c5. He wants to undermine that outpost for the knight. Challenging the pawn on d4 is a very interesting move. And here, various options. White can, for instance, take on c5 when you do take back with the bishop with an isolated queen's pawn, but black is very active and ready to get all the pieces out. I don't think black is really worse here. And the same after other moves. If you support a pawn with c3, it's just knight c6, the game goes on. Black is very active. Magnus goes for this move, knight c3. Interesting idea as he totally ignores the pawn on d4. However, if black does take on d4, then it's knight b5, and white is intending to regain the pawn on d4 and also attacking the bishop. Well, it's a complicated line. The bishop may go to c5, but if you do that, then the bishop and the knight are also eyeing the c7 square. There are a lot of possible tactics coming up in that line, but it didn't happen. After 2 minutes of thinking, here Hikaru decided to release the tension with the move c4, attacking the bishop on d3. Now the bishop goes to e2 with the idea that after knight c6 the bishop is much better placed on f3, attacking the pawn on d5. Therefore black goes for bishop e6, queen d2. Now white has connected its rooks, but black is also rock solid in this position and, well, decides to move away with the bishop. Not the only move, but probably if you do keep the bishop there on d6, it means that the queen also got to keep the bishop defended. Otherwise, there are potential discovered attacks with the knight. So therefore, the bishop wants to go away. And here, pawn on c4 is kind of annoying. So white played the move b3, challenging the pawn. Black decides to take. White recaptures with the pawn. And now after bishop b4, white has to watch out because this knight on c3 is vulnerable. If black does get time, he will play rook c8 intensifying the pressure against that knight, so white drops back with the knight to d3. Attacking the bishop, black decides here to swap a lot of pieces. Bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, and now the move bishop to g4. Black is trading off its bad bishop for this annoying bishop on f3. Also, the rooks are coming off the board now. Rook takes e8, queen takes, bishop takes g4, knight takes g4, and after rook e1, the queen goes back to c8 to overprotect the pawn on b7. In case a knight would land on c5, that pawn is well defended. White goes for the move h3, attacking the knight, and the knight goes back. Now, it's time to make up the balance here. What is happening on the board? It's a bishop versus a knight. Black has an isolated pawn on d5, but it cannot easily be attacked. Apart from that, black's position doesn't really have any weaknesses, and if black were allowed here to play a few more moves, the queen and the rook are about to join play, and the game looks very even. Also, you got to reckon with this move, knight e4, when the knight will come in. But look what happens. White goes for the move knight b4, putting pressure against the knight on c6. Now, very interesting moment, as there follows this move, knight e4 anyway. The knight attacks the queen on c3. But look what Magnus did. He took on c6. That's very exciting because he's sacrificing the queen. And the big question is black just gonna recapture or take the queen? Well, if you do take the queen, there is knight e7 with a knight fork. White is about to win back that queen. King f8, knight takes c8, rook takes c8, bishop d6, king g8. And now the rook can come into e7. And I think Hikaru calculated this line and felt, well, this rook is simply too active. However, things are not that simple. It does make sense here to play a move like h6 to avoid any back rank issues. The king can always escape. If you do take the pawn on b7, black is in time to generate counterplay. With knight e2, king f1, you do take the pawn on d4. Everything is getting swapped, and that means that black is in okay shape. That's going to be very likely a draw. However, Hikaru didn't calculate that deeply. Being shorter on time, you got to make quick decisions. In fact, he instantly recaptured with the b pawn on c6. Now the queen can move again, but here, look at the structure on the queen side. I think these pawns are potential targets, and it's not easy to deal with them. What should black do? Should he really try to support these pawns with its major pieces or try to become active? Well, an idea here for black is to become active with the move queen f5 to hit the bishop. If the bishop goes away, the pawn on f2 may be attacked as well. The queen also indirectly undermines this pawn on c2. I think this is the way to go. You should probably try to compensate your structural weaknesses with piece activity. That's usually a good thing to do. However, was not played in the game by Hikaru. He decided to play this move, h5. That's a very radical move. He wants to create some luft for its king, but it could also have been done with a move like h6. And I think in a few moves he may regret having advanced this pawn that far. Let's see how it works out. White kicks the knight out with the move f3. Attacking the knight goes back, and now the rook comes into e5. You're not really threatening to take the pawn yet because it's defended by the knight, but now the knight on f6 is kind of stuck. And the plan of white is very instructive because the queen goes to d7, everything is defended on the queen side, but here the queen goes back to e1, a beautiful regrouping of white's pieces. The queen is about to join the action on the king side. Rook e8 and the queen goes to h4. Here you can feel the vulnerability of this pawn on h5. Black can never really swap the rooks on e5 because of d takes e5, and after the knight goes away, the pawn on h5 will be taken. Therefore, you got to wait passively. Rook e6 was played, but step by step Magnus improves his position with the move queen g5. That's a very good move. So here you have a very unpleasant position as black. If you make a waiting move like queen e7, then at some point white is gonna take, black recaptures, and the bishop comes into e5 with a plan to take on f6 at the right moment, after which the pawn on h5 can be taken. Of course, you're not in a rush. You can make useful waiting moves first, improve your pawn structure on the queen side so that everything is protected, or improve your king, but this is not going to be fun. And getting under pressure, Hikaru wants to defend in a different way. He decides to play here the move g6 to protect the pawn, but now the knight on f6 is even more vulnerable. And look, Magnus senses the opportunity, takes on e6, queen recaptures, and the bishop comes to e5, attacking that knight on f6. So the knight goes back to e8, but now the queen comes in to h6, threatening checkmate on h8. And, well, this is problematic. You cannot close the diagonal for this bishop with a move f6, as that hangs the pawn on g6. So black needs to come up with a different plan so that the king can escape, and that's with the move f5. But then the queen comes into h8 anyway. King f7, queen h7, king goes back to f8. And now it's queen takes a7. Here you can very nicely see that with strong pieces like the queen and the bishop, you can easily switch from one side to another. And the weaknesses on both sides of the board, they prove to be fatal in this case. So after queen takes a7, it's knight f6, queen c7, the queen centralizes again. And white, once again, is not in a rush. After king e8, he just first improves the position of the king. And, well, the bishop is totally dominating the center. There are not that many useful moves to be suggested here for black. They follow the move h4, which is an ambitious move, but the pawn is now also more isolated from the other pawns. And I think a move like queen g7 with ideas of attacking these weaknesses makes a lot of sense. But Magnus decides to go for bishop d6. He wants to play for mate, and he's attacking the other pawn on c6 now. Now the queen on e6 no longer defends the pawn. Queen d7, queen b8. So here the king is in trouble, and you're having a very difficult moment as black, because what are you going to do? Are you dropping in between with your queen, or do you just play a move like king f7? Well, in that case, there's queen f8, king e6, bishop comes back to e5, threatening mate. If the knight goes back, then you can attack this weakness on h4, and black's position is falling apart. So here the set move, queen d8, had to be played. And also now Magnus very well understands that, okay, if white is not able to break through in the attack, then you need to think about how the endgames are. So he considered here the exchange of queens. He played it and decided to come back with the bishop to f4, threatening to play this move, bishop g5, after which the knight is pinned, and also the pawn on h4 cannot easily be defended, not at all. Knight h7 to prevent the bishop from coming to that square. Bishop d2, another fantastic idea. King d7, the king is activated. Now the bishop comes to e1, hits the pawn on h4, black protects it, and if white is careless, if white thinks to bring the king to the center, then black is able to lock up the king side. That needs to be avoided. But with the move f4, you're challenging that pawn on g5. That cannot be protected by a pawn any longer. So black decides to take, but now it's bishop takes h4. And white has an extra pawn on both sides of the board. Well, on the king side it's actually 2 versus 2, but it's an outside post h pawn. So white is technically winning. And look at the very fine technique of world's number 1. King e6, king g1. Now the king comes to the center. King f7, king f2, knight f8. The knight is going to be employed on the e6 square to protect the pawn and attack the pawn on d4, but white just protects it with a very simple move, c3. Very efficient move, because after king g6, now the bishop doesn't have to defend the pawn. It can just come to d2. And then the pawn on f4 is about to fall. Let me show you some line here. If you do make a waiting move, king f6, there's bishop d2. And the pawn is falling. If you go king g5, the cutest way to convert here is this beautiful bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes f4. Definitely both players had seen it. That's why it was not played in the game. Knight takes f4. h4 can be played in that case. And you're deflecting the king. King has to take the pawn, and king takes f4. White is going to pick up all the remaining pawns, and that's an easy win. So therefore in the game, Hikaru decided not to protect the pawn on f4 one more time. Play the move knight to g5, but then it's king takes f4. White has managed to win a second pawn, and there's absolutely nothing you can do here. 2 extra pawns, it's too much. The king is threatening to infiltrate via the e5 square. So here, also being very low on time, Here Hikaru had seen enough, lost the Armageddon game, and what a fantastic game by Magnus Carlsen. You see that he really wanted to play with the white pieces, which put a lot of pressure on him. Nobody pressed him. He did it all himself, but he did it with a very conscious reason that in the end, he knows that he is capable of winning these sort of games against the strongest players in the world. So very, very nice play by Magnus. Let's see what's going to happen in the next few days in this very nice tournament in Toronto.